The standard story goes that The Blue Angel was Dietrich's first film, but where the truth of the story is, I think why people maybe fasten onto it and why Dietrich herself was so invested in promoting this story was because it was, in a sense, the birth of the Dietrich persona. Paramount was, of all of the studios, probably the most aggressive in seeking out acting talent from other countries. They wanted to find female acting talent that had this kind of mysterious foreignness that could allow them to compete and perhaps attract a kind of export audience. Of course, at this point, Garbo was a very big star name already at MGM. And of course, she had come from Sweden and had acted as well in the German film industry.
Dietrich was brought in to resemble Garbo for Paramount to do, what MGM had done with a kind of beautiful, narcissistic. I mean, there was a very kind of, self-absorbed sexuality that they both projected, but they were also really different. And there was a way in which Dietrich really was about the sexology movement. Like, there was a very clear understanding of her sexuality as being part of this kind of nightlife image. So Dietrich's construction of femininity, her performance of an extreme version of female masquerade, was sort of at root what stardom's about, is to construct an image, but they just pile it on, she and von Sternberg. There wasn't just makeup and razor-sharp eyebrows. There was also a veil and some feathers and a cigarette and, lingering images of the legs. So there was this construction of femininity through performance that other stars hadn't had as much part of their image. And that was part of the narratives of the films, too.
There was a kind of popular notion that Dietrich was just clay in von Sternberg's hands. Film historians have known for a long time that it was a lot more complicated than that, both in terms of a personal relationship, but also in terms of how we might contextualize it in any kind of production in the studio system, that most performers were not merely the clay in any director's hands. Probably the important thing about her background in that German entertainment environment was how much it was willing to play with a kind of tension between a very open about sexuality, but at the same time play it as if it was all a game, that one could create a kind of distance from it and be not too closely identified really with any firm sexuality, that there was a kind of fluidity where certain kinds of labels that we might be wanting to put onto people's sexual identities were not all that relevant.
And this was a moment where there was back and forth with like, how much can we push this Dietrich image? I mean, the trousers were a huge success. Her wearing pants was a craze. The fan magazines were covering her lifestyle off camera, too. Dietrich actually, I think, is a great example for the term queer because so much of her eroticism was tied up with gender performance, an embrace of the possibilities of combining masculinity and femininity and not knowing exactly what that meant in terms of sexual object choice. And I think that's why she's, not pigeonholed into an identity.
I think Paramount was actually very smart at insisting that Morocco be released in America before The Blue Angel. Morocco really was the film that provided her an opportunity to create or cultivate or massage a kind of other persona for herself as the mysterious woman who's caught between two men, who, for all of her ironic aloofness, actually is capable of great passion. And of course, it paired her with Gary Cooper, who was a huge star. So it put her in a frame that she could be a hit with American audiences right off the bat.
Every moral universe needs a bad girl. It needs somebody who's going to be titillating, cannot overtly reject the moral universe that's created by the fan magazines, but can play with it, toy with it. She flirts with transgressiveness, with breaking the boundaries. Is she performing? Is she simply being scandalous because scandal is attractive within bounds?
May I have this? Of course.
It was very deliberate to include that kiss in the movie. It was playing on her reputation already from Weimar Germany of, part of her cabaret act was to sing a duet with another, cabaret star about their special friendship. And that was written into the way Hollywood wanted to promote her. She really attached stardom to a kind of modern sexuality that gave many, I think, female audience members a kind of taste of the new, of like what modern sexuality could be.
She's perfect as the antithesis of an American girl. So while American girls were expected to sort of toe the line, Dietrich could be there to add spice, to add a touch of decadence, and to keep things lively.
Dietrich thrived on this kind of laissez-faire attitude that Paramount had. She was able to, in that way, control aspects of her image. She, in a sense, took charge of some of those aspects. She understood that her success in the American system was going to be based on this cultivation of this aspect of her persona.
Lorsque tout est fini, quand se meurt votre bon rêve.
The cultivated low voice, the repertoire, all of it was so studied and repeated and ritualistic and fetishistic. It really, I think, helped people think about fantasizing their own autonomous self. Her history was really about the history of sexuality, coming up with an idea of what a queer person was. And so she played to female audiences. She had a lesbian base and she had a gay male base. And those might be slightly distinct audiences, but that kind of feeling like she's ours, when of course she belongs to everybody, and there's a way for Hollywood to capitalize on this across the board, that was hugely important. And I think that was the way that people took in that self-creation.
Laura Mulvey's important work, Visual Pleasure in Classical Narrative Cinema, points to an idea that classical Hollywood cinema is constructed around three looks: the look of the camera, the look of the character, and the look of the spectator. She also admits that the Dietrich character in the von Sternberg films also returns the gaze. So Mulvey's piece was an incredibly important opening for so many feminist film theorists to try to understand how classical Hollywood cinema works in relation to patriarchal ideas about women and patriarchal control over women.
The Dietrich character has strong continuity and strong resemblance from film to film, so that as a star, she seems very much Dietrich rather than the characters.
For the most part, the kinds of characters that Dietrich played in at least the first half of her career in the von Sternberg cycle were what we would call fallen women characters. These were women who sexually transgressed and in some way paid for this transgression. By the time that you get to Blonde Venus, this type is being perhaps questioned by the two.
She is a long-suffering wife who is dedicated to her husband and who is sacrificing herself for his health and for his well-being, and who is misunderstood, and who has a child and is on the run. These maternal and wifely aspects are central to the plot and the melodrama. At the same time, she seems most to be herself, to discover herself as Dietrich when she becomes a performer in Paris with Cary Grant. She's sort of freed by performance. Once she assumes the mask, she can express herself in many languages and be many people, while the melodrama wants to box her into a victim, suffering woman in a woman's picture, a woman's weepy. And crying is just not something Dietrich does. She is flexible, she is resourceful, she's has a will of iron, and she's not a victim, ever. So even when there are attempts to make her suffer, presumably in a Hollywood way to make her sympathetic, she is more sympathetic as a survivor.
So after that first kiss in Morocco, where she comes on in a tuxedo and is playing on a costume that she'd worn in Blue Angel, there had to be a cross-dressing scene in every film.
Hollywood in this period is becoming more and more conservative. 1932, there's an attempt to bring in a production code. It doesn't really stick until 1934 when the Hayes office really cracks down.
Via Will Hayes' intervention and working with the Hollywood producers, they brought in Joseph Breen to manage the Production Code Administration, and that took over from this earlier committee, and had a set of very firm procedures about representations. And the Dietrich von Sternberg collaborations were films that were the most threatened. The production code was a huge factor in changing Paramount's idea about this von Sternberg-Dietrich collaboration.
She came to be disliked. She was not seen as being of Hollywood and seen as being the sort of import, sort of forced on people, that Paramount promoted her because Paramount was associated more with European films and with European stars. And it's harder and harder to accommodate Dietrich's sort of special qualities while trying to fit her into a post-code era. The films are becoming more conservative. Androgyny is not as popular anymore. Hints of gay identity are not allowed anymore. Any kind of sexuality outside of marriage is not allowed anymore. And so she's sort of boxed in. And this is the period when they start to call her box office poison, and there's a reaction against her and her type. At the low point of her career in Hollywood, when there's sort of a public glee in her lack of popularity, and von Sternberg as well, there's a movie made at Warner Brothers called The Stand-In in 1937 with Joan Blondell. It's a Hollywood movie about Hollywood. The studio is having trouble, financial trouble, and so the bankers back east send an accountant to find out what's going on and to, in effect, shut down the studio. And Joan Blondell is a stand-in for a Dietrich-like movie star, and she argues with the accountant that you can't close the studio, it'll put all these regular people out of work. The villains of the piece are the Dietrich character, who's the diva who luxuriates in her dressing room while the stand-in does all of the hard work out on the set, and her director, who is a pretentious European arty guy who wears a beret and riding boots and has a riding whip, and it sees himself as an artist. And he's ruining the studio by making a jungle picture with his protege, where it's characterized by 3 or 4 minute long close-ups in soft focus with netting and vines and leaves, and the film just stops the narrative to worship the star. What finally happens is the accountant goes Hollywood, and he decides with the head of production, Humphrey Bogart, to recut the picture and save the studio by eliminating all the close-ups of the star and replacing her with a chimpanzee. This will obviously save the studio, be a big hit, and she'll be put in her place, and the pretentious von Sternberg-type director is exposed as a fraud, a thief, and expelled from Hollywood. So this shows the publicly known hostility toward Dietrich and von Sternberg in Hollywood, and that also the assumption that the audience would know who this would be, that this would be quite obvious to the audience that it would be Dietrich and von Sternberg, that their public personas were so well established that people could recognize caricatures immediately.
It's really after Dietrich leaves the von Sternberg orbit permanently that she moves into a period in which certainly that earlier persona is not left behind, but it's augmented by a kind of maturity, a kind of independence, by a versatility, perhaps, that was not evident in some of the earlier promotion and publicity or the parts that she played. So the film Destry Rides Again becomes a vehicle in 1939 for her kind of resurrection.
The change, I think, comes with Destry Rides Again, when she is put in an ultra-American setting of the American West. And she is game, and she's willing to play comedy, because the Sternberg films are not big on comedy. So she is redefined as American by adoption. And her foreignness is not as important as her embrace of America and her war work. I think she was quite overtly anti-Hitler and pro-America and pro-allies against Germany. After Destry, she is incorporated back either as someone who's become fervently American, as the most patriotic is the recent immigrant. And she wasn't recent, but her Americanness was always emphasized in the 40s and in the 50s, that she was an American citizen, that she worked for the war effort unstintingly, unhesitatingly. Her acting after the 30s, she plays Germans in Foreign Affair, in Judgment at Nuremberg. She plays Germans as the bad guy. She could play the bad German in a film because she was the good German in real life, and that carried her from then on. Partly it's the reason that people saw that Dietrich was not simply a puppet of von Sternberg, is that Dietrich's career continued without von Sternberg, and his didn't continue without her. She could make a film like Angel with Lubitsch. She could make Destry Rides Again and be a big success on her own, quite clearly separate from von Sternberg, whereas von Sternberg's films without Dietrich are disappointing. He sort of became stereotyped as an European filmmaker and castigated for that, whereas Dietrich was able to make an adjustment. How do you remain loyal? How do you establish your independence while remaining loyal? How do you not look like somebody who uses people and then dumps them? This is something that female stars had to negotiate before Dietrich, and she had to negotiate again, showing loyalty to von Sternberg without being anchored to von Sternberg.
Dietrich's own words about von Sternberg were always in the service of elevating him as a great artist.
I've done enough talking for tonight.
And her gratitude for what she learned from him. This was true, and she wasn't shy necessarily about showing that. It was always framed in the sense that she was lucky to have been associated with a kind of master, somebody that could create a visual iconicity for her. I think obviously the greatest number of interpretations, critiques, theories about Dietrich and how her performance style or her characters, what they say about classical Hollywood cinema, have been focused on the von Sternberg films. However, her work in Westerns has been discussed. Her being a strong female character is introduced into other genres where you might not expect those kinds of characters. Her relationship to stardom itself, outside of any particular text, and the way that she struggled and managed to control much of her own image is itself a kind of feature of a lot of film critique. And one of the things I think that's remarkable about Dietrich is that she has meant so much to so many different constituencies. Her ability to reinvent herself as an international concert star, as a Vegas entertainer. This is of interest to people that are trying to understand the relationship between film as a medium versus other kinds of performing arts, and where audiences and subcultures, their interest in her figure as representing this possibility that there's a kind of fluid and transgressive sexuality that can't be contained by heteronormative understandings of sexuality.
A wonderful reading of the sort of homosociality and homoerotics of the Dietrich image is by Judith Main, and goes back to the Blue Angel. And when she's backed up by all of these other cabaret women, because they're very fleshy, there's a total exchange of the gaze between them. They're all kind of objectified, but what's going on among these objects is really a fascination to the camera, to the audience, and it makes her inaccessible. That's what stardom's about.